The success signal for a politician or bureaucrat is not profit, but power. A government official succeeds not by pleasing customers, but by increasing his sphere of control over the lives of others. This is why each politician struggles so hard to win elections, pass dozens of new laws, and increase the amount of patronage he has to give out. This is why each gray and faceless bureaucrat toils incessantly to increase the size, powers, and budget of his department and the number of men working under him. The power signal unerringly guides government officials toward those actions which produce the most control over other men. Private enterprise maintains and expands itself by continually offering people things they want. Government maintains and expands itself by depriving people of things they want by means of forcibly seizing their goods, taxation, and forcibly preventing them from trading and living as they choose, regulation. Thus, private enterprise continually increases the prosperity and well-being of its customers, while government continually decreases the prosperity and well-being of its citizens. But worse than anything else it does to its citizens is the fact that government cannot avoid forcibly sacrificing the just interests of at least some of them. Any government must make decisions and act on them, since it could claim no justification for its existence if it did nothing at all. Theoretically, the leaders should always act in the interest of the people, because it would be immoral to impose on the people actions which were contrary to their interests. But since not all the individuals who make up the people will find the same things to be in their interest, it follows that at least some of them must have proper, just interests which are different from, or even in opposition to, the supposed public interest. This means that some citizens, those without political influence, must sacrifice their interests, hopes, ambitions, and even property and lives to further the national interest. Since people should not, and usually do not, give up such values willingly, any group not based on totally voluntary membership must employ coercion to force the sacrifices which its leaders and rulers consider to be in the group's interest. Limiting a government to the functions of protection and arbitration would lessen the sacrifices demanded of the citizens, but could never eliminate them. The wastefulness of checks and balances and the inefficiency of an organization beyond the reach of competition makes governmental services far costlier and less effective than those provided by business. Thus, being forced to buy protection services from the government is certainly a sacrifice. Any government, if it is to remain a government, must hold its monopoly status by coercion, which means it must force sacrifices on its citizens. Every individual person has the responsibility to discover what his interests are and to work toward their achievement. When government takes some of this responsibility away from the individual, it must also take away some of his freedom of action, i.e. it must violate human rights. Further, when government forces an individual to act against his proper interests, it is forcing him to act against his own rational judgment. Such an action, in effect, puts the opinions and whims of others between a man and his perception of reality, and thus compels him to sacrifice his basic tool of survival, his mind. Government has always been a ball and chain holding back human progress and welfare. This shackle was bad enough in primitive times when life was relatively simple. In a complex society with a complex technology and nuclear weapons, it is suicidal idiocy. Government is simply inadequate to the complexities of modern life, a fact which is becoming increasingly apparent in the blundering ineptitude of governmental solutions to social problems, the perennial confusion and contradictions in governmental policies, and successive breakdown of governmental programs. Government at best is a primitive anachronism, which the human race outgrew somewhere around the time when men moved out of their caves, and which we should have dispensed with long ago. The majority of people firmly believe that we must have a government to protect us from domestic and foreign aggression, but government is a coercive monopoly which must demand sacrifices from its citizens. It is a repository of power without external check, and cannot be permanently restrained. It attracts the worst kind of men to its ranks, shackles progress, forces its citizens to act against their own judgment, and causes recurring internal and external strife by its coercive existence. In view of all this, the question becomes not, who will protect us from aggression, but who will protect us from the governmental protectors? The contradiction of hiring an agency of institutionalized violence to protect us from violence is even more foolhardy than buying a cat to protect one's parakeet. In view of the real nature of government, why have the majority of men throughout history accepted and even demanded it? Perhaps the most obvious reason is that the vast majority of men have not developed much ability to generate or even to accept new ideas, particularly those radically different from the familiar ones compromising the cultural status quo. There have been governments as far back as recorded history reaches, and to picture with some detail how we could manage without one requires more mental effort than many of the people are willing to expend. Besides, that which is new, strange, and unknown is frightening, and it's more comfortable to push the whole matter out of one's consideration by simply declaring that it wouldn't work anyway. You Wright brothers will never get that contraption off the ground. Government officials have used every possible tool to convince people that government is necessary. One of their most effective weapons has been government-supported education, which brainwashes the young into patriotism before they're capable of judging for themselves and creates a class of pro-state intellectuals whose ideas create a pro-state populace. Another trick has been to invest government with tradition and pomp and to identify it with our way of life so that to be against government is seen as being against everything which is familiar, noble, and good. Another factor contributing to the acceptance of government is that a great number of people have a nagging and usually unadmitted fear of self-responsibility, of being thrown completely on their own resources. This goes far deeper than just the knowledge that with no government there would be no welfare checks or plush bureaucratic jobs. It's a deep fear of the responsibility and risk of having to make one's own decisions and accept the consequences, with no ultimate authority to appeal to for guidance and to blame in the case of failure. This is the reason for such cries as, "We must have strong leadership in this time of crisis! We need new and better leaders!" and "God, give us a leader!" People who fear responsibility find it easier to call for leaders, even when those leaders may become tyrants, than to accept the risk and effort of looking for solutions to the problems that beset them. Remember the Heil Hitler patriotism of Nazi Germany and the horror and its atrocities it led to? Without a government to furnish this leadership, such people would feel hopelessly lost and adrift. But even with all this, the majority of people might have accepted the idea of a government-free society long ago if they hadn't been sold the notion that the only alternative to government is chaos. Government may be evil, they feel, but after all, it's a necessary evil. Aside from the fact that there are no necessary evils, when one considers all the chaos governments have caused, with their violations of men's liberty, arbitrary interferences with the market, and wars for plunder and power, the assumption that government prevents chaos appears more than a little ridiculous. The free market is quite capable of preventing chaos, and would do so without violating men's liberty or carrying on wars of aggression, as this book will demonstrate. The actual choice is not government versus chaos, but the chaotic rigidity generated by governmental aggressions versus the peaceful, evolutionary progress which naturally results from free men trading in an open market. Government isn't a necessary evil, it's an unnecessary one.